5 people were moderately wounded in a terror shooting attack that took place today near a shopping center in Ma'ale Adumim. The terrorist was equipped with an M16 rifle and was neutralized at the site by an Israeli border police officer who was off duty. Mada paramedics provided medical treatment on the scene, and the injured were evacuated to the hospital.
A surprising report. According to Axios, the head of the Israeli Mossad spy agency secretly visited the White House recently to discuss a potential normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Axios report details about Mossad Director David Barnea taking part in the Washington talks as part of the Biden administration's full-born effort to reach a Jerusalem-Riyadh deal. During the supposed visit, Barnea met with senior White House and CIA officials to discuss Israel's security interests in a potential U.S.-Saudi bilateral agreement. The U.S. has been trying to improve their relations with Saudi Arabia for the last year and a half, and this push for normalization is only part of the efforts. According to numerous previous reports on a potential normalization deal between Israel and the Saudis, Riyadh is seeking NATO-style defense and security pact with the United States, Israeli concessions to the Palestinians, and a civilian nuclear program, a demand long opposed by Washington and Jerusalem. Axios reports that the White House is pushing a diplomatic breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia, targeting the end of the year ahead of the U.S. election campaign. And in other news, deep divisions in society over the judicial reform are causing harm to national security. That's the word from Defense Minister Yoav Galant, who warned in a closed-door meeting of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee that the damage is to deterrence and military cohesion. ILTV's William Sharon reports.
Meeting the Knesset Committee in his Defense Ministry office in Tel Aviv, Galant reportedly told lawmakers that the military has been damaged by thousands of reservists, announcing they will end their volunteer duty to protest the government's judicial reform. The defense minister said there has already been harm done and more could come, and urged reservists to reserve direction and keep IDF service out of its arguments. Galant said that currently the IDF is capable of carrying out all of its tasks, but there were concerns moving forward. Military officials speaking at the meeting reportedly warned lawmakers that Israel's enemies see the situation as an opportunity to attack. The IDF military intelligence officials reportedly told members of the committee that Israel's ability to establish a credible military threat against Iran has been undermined amid the tensions over the judicial reforms and Israel's weakened relations with the U.S. More than 10,000 reservists have warned they will not be able to serve in an undemocratic Israel, which they claim the country will become if the government's judicial plans are realized. The IDF relies heavily on volunteering reservists, especially pilots, for its routine activities. Coalition and opposition leaders have called for reservists not to refuse service.
And so joining us now with more on the legal reform and the efforts to find a consensus is ILTV's insider host, Steve Leibowitz. Steve, always great to have you in the studio.
My pleasure.
So a lot has happened in the last week since the coalition passed the first part of the legal reform. Can you fill us in on some of the highlights?
Sure. The Prime Minister has spoken to every one of the American media outlets that exists and to none of the Hebrews. So if you understand English, you know exactly what's going on. And that is, the Prime Minister is defending what took place. He said it was necessary. It's correcting an historic injustice. When asked very specifically about whether he will accept a bagatz, a high court ruling, if it's thrown out in the courts, which is going to happen in early September, then Netanyahu was very indecisive. He was unwilling to say whether he would accept the bagatz, even when asked repeatedly. At the same time, the coalition is saying, we will go back to talks with Netanyahu, but only if he freezes things for 18 months, in other words, into 2025. Netanyahu is indicating, well, you've got actually only until November. As soon as they come back, as the Knesset members come back from the break for the summer in the beginning of September, it could be that if the coalition is not working together with us, we'll continue with the reforms as we were until now.
Although Bibi has indicated, or he has said as well, that he will abide by the law because Israel is a democracy and a law-abiding country. But you prepared a report on this. Let's take a look.
The full roster of the High Court of Justice will deliberate the government's basic law amendment that limits court oversight of its own actions. Supreme Court President Esther Chayut issued a statement saying that every justice on the court would preside over this hugely significant and potentially explosive hearing against the law, which, together with the rest of the coalition's judicial reform agenda, yielded 30 weeks of mass protest. The law, an amendment to basic law, the judiciary, prohibits the court from reviewing government and ministerial decisions through the judicial reasonableness standard. The 8 petitions the court has accepted against the law will be heard on September 12th. NBC's Meet the Press asked Prime Minister Netanyahu what he would do if the courts strike down the reasonableness law.
I think we have to follow 2 rules. One is Israeli governments abide by the decisions of the Supreme Court, and at the same time, the Supreme Court respects the basic laws, which are the closest thing we have to a constitution. I think we should keep both principles, and I hope we do.
So you are committing, if the Supreme Court strikes down this legislation, you will abide by that ruling?
Remember what I said. I hope that they don't strike down, because I think we should abide by both rules.
Opponents of the law say the reasonableness standard serves as a critical safeguard against arbitrary government actions. The coalition argues that the Supreme Court has abused the standard and that it gave the court too broad a scope to intervene in government policy.
So as we just heard, Netanyahu saying that on the one hand, the Israeli government will abide by the court's ruling. On the other hand, he hopes the court will maintain the status quo and not interfere in Israel's basic laws.
The court has never, ever, ever knocked out a basic law. A basic law is almost the equivalent, or the Israeli equivalent, to a constitution. But there's a problem, because we just passed a basic law in a matter of a few months. You know, if you want to make an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, you're not an American, I guess, but if you want to...
I am American.
Oh, you are. So you have to get 2/3, so you know this, you have to get 2/3 of the states to approve any constitutional amendment. It's a long,
different
process.
systems of
Totally
government,
different.
Very different from U.S. and
That's
Israel,
right.
both still democracies.
Both democracies.
So this is what you'll be covering in depth on ILTV's Insider this week. What can you tell us?
Well, I have 2 amazing guests. First of all, we have Ari Harrow, who was here in the studio with us. He was the Prime Minister Netanyahu's top advisor. He was the chief of staff for a number of years. Nobody was closer to the Prime Minister. If anyone can explain to us what the Prime Minister's next moves are, it's Ari Harrow, and we'll hear that. And the second guest is the man that I consider to be, and I'm not exaggerating here, the smartest man in the state of Israel. Yossi Klein Halevi is a philosopher. He's a man of literature. He is so bright on so many issues and insightful. He's just a pleasure to listen to. So I invite all of the viewers to tune in tonight for Insider.
Absolutely. I mean, it'll be really interesting to hear what Netanyahu's next steps might be, or sort of take a look or delve more into that topic. I mean,
but what was really interesting to me is the point that I was actually able to get these 2 guys, both from right-wing places, but both taking completely different positions on judicial reform and on what the situation is of Israel today. And I actually managed to find a few points, not too many, but a few points of actual agreement between them. And I actually got Yossi Klein Halevi to say that he does not completely rule out the possibility of a national unity government with Netanyahu. If you want to see how we got there, you'll have to tune in.
Absolutely. And, you know, I do want to talk, though, about this issue of national unity. I mean, right now, Netanyahu is, as you mentioned, going abroad on news stations, trying to sort of calm the waters, explain what's happened. And here in Israel, though, there is a lot of talk about a consensus about national unity. What can you tell us on that end?
Well, he's calming the waters in Washington, where the problem doesn't exist. There is no internal Israeli problem on the streets of Washington. The problems are here in Israel. So if you want to have talks, you have to convince Yair Lapid to join you and Benny Gantz to join you. I don't see as much effort being made in that direction yet. It could be that Netanyahu is playing a time game. In other words, he's going to say, like he did with the reasonableness law, he's going to say all the way along that we are going to encourage, we want the talks, we want the opposition to sit with us and reach an agreement. And then he'll blame the opposition when an agreement is not reached. And then possibly, around the beginning of September, when the Knesset's back, we will see a new round of reform legislation being pushed. But it's at the same time as the Bagatz.
That's one possibility, one scenario. I mean, on the other hand, we are seeing talk of a national unity government. Benny Gantz, in the meantime, remaining silent on this possibility, but opposition leader Yair Lapid outright rejecting any possibility of joining a government with Netanyahu. Is that correct?
Look, I think that both of them, in theory, reject the idea of having a unity government with Netanyahu under any circumstances until they change their mind. Both of them can change their mind, and I'll tell you what can change their mind. Last time it was COVID to save the country for Benny Gantz. This time it will be the prospects of a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, the ultimate prize of Israeli acceptance, the Holy Grail. And to get that and to have that as his legacy, I think Netanyahu would sacrifice his current coalition because he'd have to get rid of the right wing of his coalition. He would need the center, and then you'll suddenly hear for a period of time an entirely different Netanyahu that's reaching out for understanding and agreement so that peace can be achieved with Saudi Arabia. Let's see Yair Lapid say no to that.
Well, that is certainly an incredible legacy to leave behind. Steve Leibovitz, thank you so much for joining us today. Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple. And moving on, in southern Lebanon, clashes between Palestinian factions continue in the Ain al-Khilweh, with at least 11 people killed so far and dozens more injured. At least 11 people died so far in the intensifying clashes between Palestinian factions in the Lebanese Ain al-Khilweh Palestinian refugee camp, with dozens injured and thousands of families forced to flee their homes in the crowded camp. The clashes were sparked over the weekend following an attempt to assassinate a terrorist affiliated with one of the several Islamist groups operating in the camp, then spiraling into ongoing heavy machine gun fire exchanges as several Fatah members were gunned down by rival Islamic terrorist groups. A ceasefire was attempted by the parties involved and then was broken shortly after. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas spoke with Lebanese officials to discuss the escalation in violence, while Hamas condemned the clashes. Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati asked the Palestinian leaders to cooperate with the Lebanese army, stressing the need to demilitarize the camps. According to UNRWA, about 250,000 Palestinian refugees live in 12 refugee camps and villages in Lebanon, mostly in poverty. In the wake of the killings, Israel's permanent representative to the UN, Gilad Erdan, criticized the lack of international outcry on this latest wave of violence among the Palestinians in the camp, and criticized UNRWA for failing to integrate Palestinians into countries and their societies such as Lebanon, and instead perpetuating the conflict. And a 2-week joint Israeli and U.S. naval exercise, Intrinsic Defender, got underway this week. The U.S. Fifth Fleet joins the Israeli Navy for 2 weeks in training for multiple scenarios. ILTV's Devo Klein reports.
The Israeli Navy and the United States Fifth Fleet will include training on land and in the sea. The two navies will practice detection and monitoring in the maritime space, inspection of vessels, and search and rescue scenarios. There will also be joint training for taking over vessels and responding to terrorist activity. Sailors from the Israel Yalitam Underwater Missions Unit and their U.S. counterparts will practice joint dives, locating, removing, and neutralizing naval mines using remotely manned underwater vessels. In addition, the two fleets will hold sessions in the field of naval and underwater medicine, as well as emergency medicine. The IDF has said, "This is a significant exercise which constitutes an opportunity for joint learning, strategic and operational enhancements, and the strengthening of the shared dialogue between the fleets, and assists in promoting regional partnership to thwart the threats that the region is facing."
And in other news, Israeli archaeologists have uncovered a building in Jerusalem that was apparently decimated by fire in 586 BCE. Researchers believe this building burned down during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem because of the intense damage discovered in the massive structure.
We are located at the City of David National Park, the Givati parking lot excavations that are being conducted by the Israeli Antiquity Authority and Tel Aviv University. In our excavations here, we unearthed a building, and the building was heavily destroyed by fire. When we excavated, we saw tons of stones, pottery smashed on the floor, and wooden beams that were burnt. Everything is indicating a very violent destruction.
Named Building 100, this site and the remains in it occupied archaeologists as they attempted to identify the intensity, direction, and origin of the fire that destroyed it in order to determine if the fire was intentional and part of the historic Babylonian destruction.
This monumental floor that was exposed here gave us the rare opportunity to reconstruct the magnetic field of the Earth at the 9th of Av, 586 BCE, since it contains magnetic minerals. Once this floor was heated to very high temperatures, they all aligned with the magnetic field of the Earth of the time.
This information comes right around the time of the Jewish mourning day of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, which took place last week, commemorating the destruction of both temples in Jewish history.
This archaeological event is echoed very well in the biblical text. The text described that he burned all the houses of Jerusalem, and all the houses of the dignitaries he burned in fire. So what we got here is one of these big houses, public houses of Jerusalem that were burned down during the destruction of Jerusalem in 9th of Av, 586 BC.
A remarkable discovery. And now in other news, as Israel and the Jewish world face growing divisions, a new program is using conversations about the Jewish state to bring people together. Created by senior Rabbi Erez Sherman of the Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, a well-known conservative synagogue, and with support from Jewish National Fund USA's Borishin Center and others, the Israel Fellowship is bringing rabbinical students from across the religious spectrum together for conversations about the future of Zionism and of Israel. And so joining me now from California is Rabbi Erez Sherman, along with rabbinical students Tori Green and Max Hollander of the Reform and Orthodox movements, respectively. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
So my first question is for you, Rabbi Sherman. Most people would assume that Israel or subjects about Israel form sort of a core component of American rabbinical curriculums. But to my understanding, this is actually not the case?
So it is the case that Israel, as I learned at the Jewish Theological Seminary, God, Torah, and Israel, those are our three topics that define who we are as Jews. But what I saw within the last decade or so was that there are so much that needs to be covered, that what could we at Sinai Temple Israel Center provide that will supplement what is already happening. And the thing that I think was missing was that we were in our bubbles, our ivory towers, wonderful academic institutions, but not having the conversation across the denominations. And so when I look at my two new friends and students and future colleagues of Max and Tori, I see what happened on a bus in Israel with seminars before and now seminars after, and what's happening in Israel today, that based on our education that we have provided these students, we have provided not answers, but a model of discourse that can be followed for the future that will allow not oneness, because I'm not looking for oneness, I'm looking for diversity of opinions at the same table. And I believe that in year one, we have achieved the goals for that model.
And Tori, can you share what inspired you to take part in this fellowship?
Yeah, so I am largely involved in the Israel conversation. I have an Instagram account, Divrei Tori, where I educate on Israel and Judaism. And also my Jewish upbringing has been cross-movemental, which is to say that I was a Hebrew school dropout growing up. And then when I went to college, I got really involved with Chabad on campus. And then I got involved with a more pluralist Jewish story and engagement. And now I'm at a Reform institution. And so for me, it is a priority to be a seam sitter, to be talking across the movements, across different Jewish opinions and understandings. And so the opportunity that was like the intention of this fellowship felt very aligned for me. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to be in that space where I knew that we were going to be building cohorts across movements.
And Max, turning now to you with regards to your rabbinical studies. I mean, given everything taking place in Israel right now, do you feel like having conversations about Israel, even with people from different denominations, is still important?
Well, personally, I can't really imagine a time where it would be more important than right now to encourage and facilitate dialogue between denominations. I think that the world that we all want and hope for is one that's built upon dialogue. And whether we like it or not, this is going to be a huge part of world Jewry and like every Jew's personal identity. And I think that a lot of people are also looking at Jews and asking us to have, or demanding that most Jews have an opinion, definitely here in the States. And I think that the best way to really confront that situation and answer those questions is with a united front. I think that to not have dialogue between denominations is to end or completely cut off any level of understanding between different denominations and different groups. And we have different opinions and we all have different perspectives to add to the situation. And I think that the only way that the situation could come even close to some sort of happy compromise is when everybody has something to say and is heard and listened to.
And, finally, Rabbi Sherman, turning back to you, I believe your Israel Fellowship has really captured the interest of some prominent backers. I mean, why do you feel that this program has sort of gained so much interest or captured the imagination of the philanthropic community?
When I asked the funders, who I just want to give a gratitude to the Paulie Singer Foundation, to JNF USA and the Baruchon Fund, to the Michael and Lisa LaFell Foundation, and to our Sinai Temple Israel Center. They asked me, why would an Orthodox and Reform student come on ILTV one day and speak to each other? And when I asked Rabbi Wolpe, my senior rabbi at the time, he said, we're not going to talk about Shabbat observance, we're not going to talk about halakha and tefillah or kashrut, but the one thing that you can actually be at the table and talk about is Israel. And that was before we started. And I watched it on our first night in Israel when our tour educator, Yisrael Klitzner, said, say one word that you're feeling. And most people said nervous. And then the last day he said, revisit that word. And what are you feeling now? And most people said excited for the future. There are challenges. We're not going to ignore them, but you can only not ignore the challenges by, in fact, sitting at the table. When you look at our WhatsApp group of our trip right now, it's not saying kumbaya, we're all saying the same thing. We're having a conversation. I'm so grateful for that WhatsApp group, that it's not tweets and Facebook posts, but it's real intelligent conversation, asking each other, what united front, as Max said, should we present? What is happening in reforms? We now have a cohort of thinkers that are able to say, this is what we want to be a part of. And so for these major foundations all to say to a synagogue, which is the revolutionary part, what can we do to create that table of diverse opinions? Sinai Temple Israel Center was able to be at the forefront, and we're excited to bring these schools, institutions, students, and future colleagues together.
Absolutely, and bringing people together and facilitating conversations is more important today than ever. Thank you all so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
And now,